and welcome everybody, and for those of you that are still coming in. So this is the next in our series of nuclear power webinars, which will again be a panel discussion moderated by Linda Pentz Gunter from Beyond Nuclear International. And the title of this webinar is The Government's Nuclear Scam, or How Building Nuclear Power Stations Will Cost the Earth and Do Nothing at All for the UK energy security or for your energy bills. And I know obviously that's a very, very important issue for all of us at the moment. And we're going to be joined this evening by Jonathon Porritt from Forum for the Future, Katrine Williams of the PCS Union, because this is obviously a very big issue for unions and for workers, Ian Ralls from Friends of the Earth Nuclear Forum, and Suzanne, Jeffery, Campaign Against Climate Change. So we're going to, I'm going to pass over to Linda in a second. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A session at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. And Russell, who you can't see at the moment, but Russell and I will pull them together and we can get on to questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to pass you on now to Linda Pentz Gunter, and I'm sure you'll all very much enjoy what we've got to hear about and talk about this evening. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Jacqui. And just a quick note for those of you watching. So this is a webinar. You have two ways of seeing this. You can do gallery view or speaker view, which means you can either see primarily whoever's speaking, or you can see all of us at the same time. So that's your choice. It's not a meeting, so you can't see the other participants who are watching this, but you can see all of us who are speaking. And I wanted to just get this started, since we're talking about the nuclear scam, with you, Jonathon, just for a quick overview of really, briefly what the fundamental problems are with the new government energy scheme, which is encouraging the construction of yet more nuclear power plants, and who that really hurts. Who does this cheat and shortchange the most?
Thanks, Linda. Well, as I'm sure you and everybody else knows, this scam, this obsession with nuclear goes back a very long way. The Boris Johnson outing at the moment is very similar to what Tony Blair came up with when he was Prime Minister, which was very similar to what Margaret Thatcher came up with. It's just that this time round, it's more cruel than anything before, because the transparent inability of the nuclear industry to deliver anything to help on security and affordability issues is now beyond contestation, to be honest. But he's right in there. We're now promised a new nuclear reactor, one a year for 8 years, 24 gigawatts worth. At least £200 million in the short term has been promised to support different aspects of the nuclear industry. We are expecting very soon a big government announcement on Sizewell C, which is the next in the decision-making process after Hinkley Point. Of course, probably one of the biggest disasters in energy policy that the world has ever seen. Latest price rises now take it to £26 billion, coming online in 2027, if we're lucky. It's just a complete nightmare, and consumers will be paying massively for this. This is a shocking story, and it's compounded, of course, by the fact that it overshadows then this need to address fuel poverty in this country, to address demand management as the essence of any proper energy strategy, with security, affordability, and decarbonization at its heart. And here the government has got an equally dreadful record of failure. As you all know, we are now looking at the constant delays in bringing back the latest round of the so-called eco scheme. Very successful scheme, actually. For the start of its first 3 phases were very successful. Millions of homes retrofitted successfully. Here's the figure that does shock people. All of that stuff done under eco actually reduced demand for gas by 20% from the domestic sector. So when people think about the Russian crisis now because of the Ukraine war, Just remember that figure. Those eco schemes reduced total gas consumption in the domestic sector by 20%, primarily in the homes of those people who needed that support most, because it helps reduce their annual energy bills by anything between 300, sometimes to 600 pounds a year. So the flagrant disregard for putting eco and putting demand management and energy efficiency at the heart of what should be happening next is as appalling a failure as this continuing obsession with nuclear. A double whammy, I'm afraid.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the context also, you know, not only of the sort of electricity bills and the fuel poverty, but obviously a serious climate crisis that's coming at us. And I want to turn to you, Ian, next on this, but just a quick note to the audience. So when we go to the Q&A, we're going to be looking at the Q&A box for questions from you. By all means, use the chat to let us know where you're coming in from, or if you want to talk to each other. But in order to get questions later, we want to look just at the Q&A for questions to our panelists. But Ian, you know, I think what struck me is that, you know, now we're in this incredible crisis, climate crisis. We've got a lot of action, climate action going on, and yet there's sort of this absence of the anti-nuclear message within the climate movement. It's either just not there, or there's sort of this tacit, well, maybe we need to, you know, incorporate it in somehow for the time being, or, you know, maybe we don't like new nuclear, but we think we should keep nuclear going. And as somebody who's connected, you know, with one of the big green groups, Friends of the Earth, what are the challenges for trying to integrate an understanding into the very passionate climate action movement why nuclear power, which all of us understand and probably most of our audience understand, is in fact more of an impediment than anything else? You know, what could turn the corner for Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and others to re-embrace anti-nuclear as part of their platform?
That is a very good question. I mean, I think, quite frankly, outright terror, quite righteous terror over climate change has, I think, caused some people's line within the environmental movement, some people's line on nuclear power to soften a bit, because it is a lower carbon option. It's not zero carbon, as is often put forward. There have been a lot of prominent environmentalists, I mean, I'll say George Monbiot there, straight out, who have bought into the lie about nuclear, being able to cut emissions and whatever, I think, and that hasn't helped at all. But I think a lot of the, well, Friends of the Earth, for instance, when nuclear power was put on the back burner back in the 90s, I think a lot of nuclear expertise was lost. A lot of people who are used to the previous arguments about nuclear, which have just been repeated now, rather expertise and knowledge and cynicism, if you like, and understanding has gone. So we, to a degree, we have to rebuild that as well, and to a degree repeat the same old arguments, which are still valid. So a lot of that has been lost. Other things were concentrated on, like I say, in the climate change, it's just been an overwhelming, quite rightly so, an overwhelming campaign. And any sort of straw that people can grasp at that may be a cure for it, you know, however incorrectly, will be grasped at. And I think nuclear power to a degree has been grasped at by some environmentalists. But I mean, the fact remains that after 70 years of nuclear power in Britain, near enough, at most we've generated 20% of our electricity from nuclear power. Electricity generation accounts for about 30% of the UK CO2 emissions. So all of that effort, all the billions of pounds that have been spent over the decades, has maybe cut our CO2 emissions by 6%. And that's assuming that nuclear power has never had a CO2 footprint, which it has. It's an absolutely pathetic return on any investment with regard to cutting CO2, never mind everything else. Even if we double the number of nuclear reactors, 12% cut, we could achieve more than that with energy efficiency measures. We could have achieved substantially more had we invested everything we've splurged on nuclear power over the decades. In energy efficiency, we would have easily saved the pathetic CO2 cut is managed. So we need to get that message across, I think. It's not a cure. There are other reasons for governments to want nuclear power, which we'll maybe go into later, you know, supporting nuclear weapons industry, covering up the cost mostly, I think, maintaining a skills base, not so much the materials, I mean, they're relatively easy to obtain if you're a government. It's maintaining the sort of overall, if you like, nuclear infrastructure for nuclear weapons. I mean, we look at nuclear power logically, that is the only possible reason, I believe, for keeping a nuclear program going.
Yeah, and we will definitely get into a bit more of that later on. But Katrine, I wanted to also ask you about obviously the union challenge, because that seems to be the other major stumbling block. We've talked about the Conservative government's policy on nuclear. The Labour government's policy on nuclear hasn't really been any better. I mean, we haven't, you know, they haven't been in government to show us exactly what it would look like in real life, but with the indications have always been supportive, and some of the statements actually coming out from Keir Starmer almost pushing them to be, you know, more invested in nuclear. So what is the challenge, especially with Unite and GMB? You know, that's not your union, I know, but what is the challenge to sort of help shift the thinking within trades unions about why actually nuclear power isn't really the answer for good long-term jobs, well-paid jobs? What could change that so that we have an avenue to pursue with unions?
Thanks. I think clearly we think that unions as a force are crucial in terms of the climate change debate and campaigning work. Obviously, I'm in a union that is absolutely implacably opposed to the use of nuclear power and wants to promote renewables. And obviously, we want to try and get the message out across our movement, and we have been doing that through the trade union Congress and so on. But and we're not affiliated to Labour either. I just wanted to make that clear as well. So, and as government workers, we generally oppose a lot of what governments do, whether it was the Blair government and subsequent governments since then as well. But I think what is important, and I think with the pandemic, with the focus on the cost of living crisis, with the absolute profits that these private companies are making. The energy companies are, I think, some of the worst companies in terms of absolutely raking in money whilst making us pay for it. I think it gives us an opportunity to start setting the agenda again in terms of what do we need? How should we provide energy in our communities? What do we need in our communities? What services do we need in our communities? How can we address the massive problems in terms of, do you heat your homes or do you put food on the table? Yeah, you can't do both. You can't afford both. So I think there is a growing need to have this discussion now. And I think it's an opportune time to really look outwards across our trade union movement. And there's 6 million workers in trade unions, and I think that's a growing number, especially over the past week with the rail strikes and so on. It's popularised why people should be in trade unions. So I think, and we can widen the issue. This isn't just about jobs in the various energy sectors, but about what sort of jobs do we want in our communities. We need jobs in our communities, but let's look at the type of jobs they are, and the really pushing again the million green jobs, the just transition, and I think that there is a change out there now where I think we can really start putting forward the alternative, but it actually hitting the ground running and actually getting people to take that up. Because I think if you harness the energy dynamism of working class people in our communities in terms of actually let's relook at what's needed, let's have a better future than we had before the pandemic, and then we can actually grow the ideas in terms of challenging nuclear isn't an answer, renewables an answer. And the reason that the government and companies don't want to do this because it'll cut into profits, because if you have a renewable infrastructure and program and plan providing that, then that's infinite, isn't it? And it probably could provide cheap or free energy to everybody. So why would you want to do that if your motives are profit? And we can cut across that, and actually our motives aren't about profit. Our motives are about what communities need, what working class people need.
And Suzanne, you've actually looked at this, I think, in depth in your own research, that you've done work that shows there are millions of jobs needed to avert a climate emergency in which nuclear plays no part at all. And so can you summarize your findings a little bit about how and why renewables and other climate mitigation areas would be much better for jobs creation?
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. I mean, our report, which is Climate Jobs, Building a Workforce for the Climate Emergency, built on the earlier work that Katrine talked about there, 1 million climate jobs. But as we approach this new updated work, I think there are some really important criteria that we needed to address, which we'd definitely addressed in the first iteration of this work, that jobs and the climate are not mutually exclusive. But they were particularly the urgency of the climate crisis. And this work comes on the back of the really significant and important climate movement that took to the streets around the climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, etc., that really at last pushed climate to the top of the political agenda in 2019. We know we had the impact then of COVID, but it still remains very, very high. The second thing was the question of climate justice and rooting our solutions in solutions which don't negatively impact others in different parts of the world. So they should be solutions which are global and impact people fairly and equally across the world. And then finally, it was actually, when we look at our carbon emissions, we have to look at the economy. Obviously, energy is a really central part of that, but it's the whole of the economy that we need to think about. For example, we are 26% of our emissions coming from transport, for example. So when we talk about transitioning and transforming our economy to match the climate crisis, then we are talking about the whole of the economy. So something like, even if the government's plans in terms of nuclear were in place, if you look at it across the whole of our emissions, this is only a 6% reduction in our emissions that nuclear, even with the government's projection, would bring about. Whereas we have to talk about tackling the whole of our economy. Now, we've explicitly rejected nuclear, really for many of the reasons that people have spoken about here, but we very much prioritize the absolute need for energy efficiency. If we were insulating our homes with a mass retrofit program, not only would we be creating many, many, many jobs, locally based, high skilled jobs, invested in locally, etc., but we would be dramatically reducing our energy use. And that actually is the cheapest and the most permanent way of reducing energy bills. And actually, the money that is talked about in terms of investment in nuclear is a direct pull away from the other things that need to happen, the things that really need to happen across our economy. And that's also one of the most crucial issues about the government's obsession with nuclear. It detracts from what really needs to happen in terms of investment in energy efficiency, investment in renewables, and a decent public transport system which will allow people to get out of their cars, but also be accessible and allow people to live the kind of lives that we need to live today. And that's essentially some summary of the report that we've produced and why we've opposed nuclear.
And I want to get onto the sort of weapons connection in a minute, but Ian, I want to pick up on something that was raised earlier about, you're saying, well, there are some environmentalists that kind of accept nuclear now because of the urgency of the climate crisis. But do you think there's a sort of misconception in the green movement about, nuclear power being kind of this benign stepchild of nuclear weapons? You're muted. I'm just going to warn you to unmute before you say anything. But is there sort of this sense of, well, nuclear power is not that bad. That's sort of, it's just another energy form, whereas nuclear weapons we accept are bad. So it hasn't sort of penetrated into the activists on the Green New Deal that actually, not only is it expensive and slow and in the way, but the risk factors involved in doing something like that are enormous and have humanitarian impacts, as Suzanne mentioned, on people in other parts of the world. And that message, this just transition message, doesn't seem to have quite translated into the climate movement in the way it should have.
I think sort of on the ground, if you like, it's on the ground that most people have a suspicion at the very least about nuclear power. There are a lot better informed who know the problems with it. And I would say the majority of grassroots support is against nuclear now for whatever reason, whether that's a fundamental opposition, they don't like the idea of nuclear, or they've actually looked into it in some detail. I tend to find it's a relatively small number of prominent environmentalists, sort of seems to go hand in hand with how famous you are. It seems to be a direct relation to, you're more likely to support nuclear power in that. Now, I don't know what the motivations are. I don't know if it's a misunderstanding. Maybe they understand something we've all missed. I don't know. I mean, George Monbiot, I agree with 99% of what he says on stuff, but he seems to have got a bit of a, as far as I'm concerned, a blind spot on nuclear power, but he's a very influential person and very well regarded. And I think the minority of key, if you like, environmentalists who support nuclear power drown out the vast majority, in my experience, of grassroots climate change campaigning who don't agree with nuclear power on whatever level. I mean, I was all primed for Extinction Rebellion in Cambridge because I'd heard a couple of people sort of supporting nuclear power. So I was marshalling all my facts and was ready for a right royal bun fight, which never materialized because most of them agreed with me. You know, so it's like I say, in my experience, it's grassroots. There is very little grassroots support in the climate movement for nuclear. It's sort of the further up you go up the food chain, there's likely to be more support. Now, I have not a clue why that happens, but like I say, but that's been my experience. Maybe other people have a different one. But.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Ian on that. I mean, it's not just George, there are a few others, but he provides that kind of go-to point of connection for the pro-nuclear greenies. George is softening his line, by the way, so bit by bit, he is moving away from his more idiotic advocacy for nuclear, which at times has been unbelievable. I think one of the reasons why that has happened is that we don't talk enough about nuclear waste. And people somehow think that we really do have a strategy for dealing with nuclear waste, which we simply don't. And the costs of dealing with nuclear waste and decommissioning increase year by year to a quite extraordinary degree. I mean, the latest report from the Public Accounts Committee showed that now the decommissioning costs will continue to rise. The starting price tag of 132 billion is now getting closer to 160 billion. The price tag for building a geological disposal facility, which started out at 12 billion, is now heading north of 50 billion. And all of these costs continue to increase year on year. And what people don't seem to understand is this is not being covered by EDF and the nuclear industry. This comes directly from taxpayers. So when we're talking of sums of money in excess of 200 billion pounds, which I think we very soon will be, and no resolution to many of these decommissioning issues for another 100 years, I really do think people will begin to get the sense that even a new generation of nuclear reactors won't sort that problem. A brilliant new report, by the way, just a couple of weeks ago from Stanford University saying that all this hype about small modular reactors producing less nuclear waste than big reactors is just that. It's pure hype. And they've done all the detailed calculations and in fact have come up with a completely staggering figure that SMRs, small modular reactors, could produce up to 30 times as much low and intermediate nuclear waste as conventional larger reactors and 5 times as much nuclear waste, high level nuclear waste and nuclear fuel. So even that SMR story is now very, very suspect. So for me, every opportunity I get, I just hammer the waste story because it is such an important part of it.
Absolutely. And I think the cost, looking at the costs as a whole, I wanted to, go to you, Katrine, maybe to talk a little bit about, the whole thing of regulated asset base for when you're actually building new nuclear reactors. So you're talking about the waste and the taxpayer money that's going to be funneled into some futile, probably won't work repository, but is also going to be funneled into new reactors to encourage EDF to build Sizewell, for example. And I've been trying to sort of think about what are some of the pressure points, and I want to ask you the same question, Suzanne, slightly differently. What might be some of the pressure points for your demographics, for the people that you work with, that would sort of wake them up to the reality of what this means? Because I would have thought RAB, where you're basically paying for something in your rates in advance that may never get completed and deliver a single watt of electricity, is sort of the ultimate fleecing of working people who are now facing increased electric bills. There's a very real crisis coming, especially probably during the winter, that this ought to be something that sparks outrage in the union movement. Would it, could it, is it something that's resonating there?
I think anything, when real costs are exposed, then that is causing outrage. And, I think, as I said, there's a lot of work being done in terms of the profits some of these companies are making in comparison with the wages that the workers are receiving in all the various sectors. And, I think that I think that strike in Hinkley Point, and the campaign rather in Hinkley Point in terms of the Unite Sparks, where EDF weren't even satisfied with paying the rate for the job for electricians. They wanted to have people that weren't even qualified electricians putting the electrics into the new nuclear power station, which, you know, you do wonder, you know, what sense that there is on that. But, you know, there were demonstrations around every single building site of all the companies that were involved in building Hinkley Point, and the sparks won. So, you know, I think, you know, even small things like that can expose these companies. But you know, I think it's a bit like PFI. It's all these things where we're paying massively over the odds for something that is providing a really poor service back, and also, you know, damaging for decades, generations to come as well. And you know, there are plenty of jobs that could be delivered in our communities, and you know, transport is obviously things that you know, Suzanne mentioned: transport, housing, the cost of living issues in our communities. Good quality jobs, you know, is a way of you know, overcoming this. And none of these employers really you know, treat the workforce brilliantly in terms of having the conditions that we'd want. So, you know, I think there is an issue around public ownership. Public ownership of energy companies is now really back on the agenda, as with transport and everything else. So I think all those things, that growing well of thought about, you know, what is better for our communities, how do we control and plan the things that we need in communities that feel cut off, abandoned, decimated. You know, our members provide support to communities that were decimated by the destruction of the mining industry. So, you know, those communities have never recovered. We need to make sure that we've got a new vision, a new alternative for actually communities up and down the country, so that there is a future. But, you know, there's, you know, our input will be invaluable in terms of making a real difference in terms of that future. So, you know, I think there's a real opportunity here to grasp the nettle now and really sort of put forward those. But, you know, the cost of all these things, the money that is being thrown at nuclear, imagine what that could do if it was actually there was input from the public and the trade union movement in terms of how that money was spent, and we'd make decisions on spending it in a much better way that would actually help society as a whole.
And Suzanne, I want to get to you as well on this, but just a quick reminder to the folks watching, the chat is obviously very lively, but if you actually have a question, please put it in the Q&A, because that is where we will be going for questions. We will not be looking in the chat for questions. We'll be looking in the Q&A. So if you do want a question asked in the next section of this program, please put it in the Q&A. But I think, Suzanne, you touched on this earlier, that there's so much that could be done that's sort of fairly fundamental, like insulation. You know, there's a whole program about insulation, retrofitting buildings, reducing fuel poverty, energy efficiency, which tends to get left out of the conversation far too much in compared to renewable energies. Lots of debate about renewable energies. But can you talk a bit about the campaign against climate change and what you're doing as a movement? And I know you have a, you know, trade union component of that, but what you're doing overall to sort of help people understand how, if you redirected every pound that you would pour down the black hole of new nuclear, what that would get you in terms of insulation, retrofit, and energy efficiency measures that would reduce cost for people and also provide employment.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also sort of, if I can answer what you asked, Linda, but also just pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, because I think that was really important when you talked about the way that the huge investment that will take place in nuclear actually will benefit the poorest the least, both through the RAB model that is about to be introduced in terms of new funding, so that we will literally have on our bills the cost of new nuclear, and the previous funding model, which is the contracts for difference, where you've got Hinkley C with a massive, Jonathon mentioned at the beginning, huge strike price going up all the time as because it's inflation linked, going up all the time, which we are also paying for as well. Now, the poorest people, the working people, already struggling with the cost of living crisis, will not be able to do the things that the well-off people will be able to do. Because well-off people will be able to pay for their own insulation and probably possibly even living in homes that are better insulated. They'll be able to pay to get solar panels in their homes and generate their own electricity in that way. So it's a double whammy. It keeps being a double and a triple whammy. The poorest people will be paying for something that isn't contributing to the climate crisis, is increasing their bills, not reducing their bills. And the things that could make a difference in terms of reducing their bills are not being invested in, are not happening, and broader in terms of tackling the climate crisis. In terms of what can we do? And you also mentioned earlier, what's the punch point, I can't remember the expression you use for our demographic. So the campaign against we kind of feel we sit within the broader environmental movement, and collaborate and organize together as we did in terms of COP26. I think there's a really crucial moment for the climate movement at this moment in time to stand in solidarity with the strikes that are taking place over the cost of living crisis and in demands for higher pay against this government that is clearly uninterested in looking out for working people. So I think we stand in solidarity at this moment in time. And I think within that, the more successful I think those campaigns are, the more confidence there is that we can actually fight for a different kind of society, one that challenges the neoliberalism of the last 30 years, the deregulation of the last 30 years that has led to the destruction of our public transport system and is currently leading to a further destruction of a decent public transport system in London. That's the goal in terms of undermining of TfL. The other thing that I think, two other things I would say that we need to do, and within that, I think we bring our own demands, the things that we're talking about here, for a mass insulation program, for public transport, for the things that will matter for working people and to tackle the climate crisis. I think we can really sort of stand together at this moment in time as much as possible. The other two things I'd say, we do need education. Ian mentioned it earlier. I don't think there's a great appetite and for it within the environmental movement, but within the trade union movement, I think it's a very mixed picture, and it depends what union you're in. For example, you mentioned, Linda, some of the unions, the GMB, etc., who organise within the Unite Prospect, who organise within the nuclear industry. But these are also big unions that organise, workers in lots of different areas of society. And not everybody will have the same position than the form position that the union is taking. So we do need education again, and I think Ian's points earlier on were right. Perhaps some of us on this call are from a generation where we were on the streets over against for nuclear disarmament, and were very live to some of the issues around nuclear full stop, as well as nuclear power. And some of those discussions and education needs to happen again in this context. And then finally, I would say this, and I think this is really important. When unions make policy, they often make policy both on their sectional interests, what impacts on their members, but also unions make policy on what happens and affects people across society as workers. And I think the question of energy has been one in which, sadly, only the unions that organise workers directly in the energy industry have made policy. And I think it's really important now that unions make policy on energy, regardless of what sectors they are. I work in education, and I would not expect education policy to simply be decided by people who work in education. Education policy is something that young people should be able to input into, parents in our community should be able to impact it. It's something that affects us all in society. So I think it's the same in terms of energy and the climate crisis. It should be something that all unions have policy on. What is the best way forward for us to allow working people to live well, and for us to tackle the climate crisis and to create jobs? And I'm really proud, for example, that my union, the NU, the National Education Union, at its most recent conference, passed what I think is a very, very good motion, and one in which we argued for some of the things I'm talking about today, but we also said that we felt that nuclear was not the way forward, and that policy stands now for our union, alongside other unions, I think like Katrine's union, that have taken a position against nuclear and have argued a different set of ideas and strategy around energy itself. So I think it's really another string that's very important that all unions have energy policy.
And I think you raised, an interesting challenge that seems to pervade a lot of things, which is how to get people to vote in their best self-interest. Because we see that happen a lot, where people vote against their self-interest, and we may have different views about Brexit, for example, but the way that's played out to a large degree shows a vote that ended up being against their self-interest. Certainly where I'm based in the US, we saw a large blue collar vote, for President Donald Trump, who was certainly not somebody who was in their best interest. So that seems to be a contradiction. So that's a challenge in the public workplace. In the government workplace, Jonathon, what explains this obsession of the government to do more nuclear power, and this gets us sort of the military connection, like what's really behind this impetus? Because it's just so illogical. It's too expensive, too slow for climate change, too dangerous, isn't a jobs creator. There's so many negatives. There isn't really much left to justify it. So what's the true agenda here?
Yes, it's illogical from every other perspective other than that of needing to remain at the high table of nuclear powers. And if that is an overarching strategic, long-term strategic goal for a country like the UK, and of course for other nuclear weapons countries, then doing what you need to do to support your civil nuclear industry is in fact logical, because in so doing, you are able to secure a greater flow of talent, of young people into the industry. You're able to build supply chains that can then meet the needs of both the military and the civil industries. And essentially, you're able to create what is referred to often as a drumbeat of pro-nuclear enthusiasm by stressing the benefits of the civil nuclear program, even as you're using that essentially to provide hidden subsidies for the nuclear weapons program. I think if people really knew the full extent of the cost of our continuing nuclear weapons program, and particularly around what we're going to have to do to upgrade some of our nuclear weapons systems over the next 15 to 20 years, I think they would be completely astonished at that. So the interesting thing, Linda, is for many, many years, that connection between the nuclear weapons establishment and the nuclear energy establishment was hidden at all costs. It was the bond that dared not speak its name. I cannot tell you the lengths that people went to make sure that nobody put these two things in the same breath. That has now started to erode. In fact, you're hearing much more explicitly, particularly from senior members of the armed forces, that this is a critical link. In France, it's much more obvious. President Macron has said time after time that we need a thriving nuclear industry, civilian industry, because we need to remain a powerful and successful nuclear weapons country. So I suspect we'll see more of that explicit linkage developing here in the UK, which may give some people a bit of a surprise, but it's going to happen. Of course, the war in Ukraine has provided us with an additional paradox in that some people might now feel that maintaining our nuclear weapons capability is absolutely of critical importance, come what may, even as they've watched nuclear missiles passing within 400 meters of one of Europe's largest nuclear reactors at Zaporizhia, which if it had just been, if it had been closer or had a direct hit, the consequences are literally unspeakable. And everybody has come to learn that nuclear facilities of every kind, whether you're talking reactors or waste facilities or whatever, they can only be truly safe in countries where you have lasting security and everything else is working really well. Well, when you go to war in another country, everything else is not working well, as we've seen.
Well, I think we'll go in a moment to the Q&A with the with the audience, but I just want to wrap up, and I'm just going to sort of throw this out to all of you to see, you know, how you'd like to respond. But what seems to emerge is the difficulty in sort of messaging, or not creating the message, but communicating the message that we aren't the high-profile George Monbiot's, we're not the UK government, we're not somebody, large position of power. So we all face this challenge in educating people. And how do we educate unions? How do we educate working people? How do we educate the public? How do we educate our government to better understand what's really needed? And so I'm just interested in the struggles you face, perhaps it's with the media not responding to the statements we make, or, are there avenues through which you can communicate this to the people you need to reach? Or are there in fact still stumbling blocks which prevent this? Because we're constantly frustrated by how, we're talking all this sense, but who's hearing? Go ahead, Leah, jump in.
I think part of the problem, or part of the attraction, if you like, for nuclear power for governments and the like, to carry on what Jonathon said, is yes, it's the nuclear weapons as well, which I already mentioned, but the fact that nuclear power station, you put it in one location and it can be hidden away, often in poorer communities in Britain, they're mostly on the coast in isolated areas. So most people don't have to face the consequences of their energy consumption. The problem with wind turbines, solar panels, insulation even to a degree, is that people have to face the consequences of their energy consumption. Around Cambridge, we've got a very wealthy, mostly Tory voting area around Cambridge. In fact, Cambridge is an extremely wealthy city as well. And some of the battle royales we've had about putting wind turbines up, wind farms and the like, have been incredible, because people are, they've been told they can't drive their 4x4, can't do this, can't do that, can't smoke in pubs. But and then someone comes along and plants a wind turbine next to them, and this is the consequences of your energy consumption. It's not generated somewhere away, probably up north, perhaps, where it's right on your doorstep. If you want electricity to pay your air conditioning, your 60-inch plasma telly, whatever, it's got to be generated somewhere, and now you're having to face the consequences. And that loses them, potentially loses the Tory party or any government in power lots of votes. If you can just locate them in isolated areas and take the flak from small, it doesn't distribute the problem over the entire country. Renewables being a dispersed source of energy. And that's very attractive to governments. I think you can hide it away, nuclear power, to a degree. You can with fossil fuel plants as well. Renewables sort of turns that on its head, and everybody has to confront the energy they're using. I think.
Anyone else want to jump in on the challenges of media, or just getting the communication through to folks?
Just from my
after you.
Just from my point of view in the trade union movement, what's worked really well is, as well as putting the criticism in and exposing the costs and everything else, is actually putting forward a vision of what is possible and that real alternative. And I think when you combine the two together, and I think the cost of all of this is so damning in terms of nuclear power. But imagine that money spent in much other ways. Wouldn't it be better if we had control over that as well? So I think there is an opportunity here to get out something that's very dynamic. Using all the work that everybody has done, pull it all together, but do it in a way to make people take ownership of it themselves, and actually sort of use it themselves. So I think that's when we've really had an echo on tax justice, on the alternative to cuts and so on. It's been when we've armed people with not simplistic arguments, but arguments that are easy to articulate and take forward, but positive ones as well, about how life could be if we actually had control over energy, over transport, over our communities. And that is a really powerful message. And I think the time is really coming to the fore now in terms of people actually having an appetite for this as well, to take it forward.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Katrine. I think, and I just wanted to say something quickly about young people, because actually building on what you just said there, I think young people are particularly concerned that there are so few ways of enabling them, empowering them to see what a really positive future looks like by 2030, 2040, 2050. I mean, it's just a dearth of opportunities for them to work and think their way through into that kind of much more hopeful, compassionate, sustainable future for them. And I think that's a really important part of it. But I have an interesting sort of dilemma here. It's, you know, the young people's campaigning on climate change has not been particularly well informed about nuclear power, if I'm being absolutely honest. There hasn't been a strong anti-nuclear strand in many young people's climate campaigns, notwithstanding the fact that their understanding of the connections between social justice and energy policy are actually much more intuitive than many other parts of the climate movement. So it's a sort of interesting issue for me. What's going to happen when young people become, again, which I'm certain they will do, as much at the forefront of climate campaigning as they were in 2019? Because we know that the COVID years have kind of knocked the stuffing out of young people's climate campaigns. And it's only just, to be honest, it's only just coming back in the way that we might expect. But it's going to be really important that at that point, young people can begin to dig down into the realities of just how cruel and unjust this pro-nuclear obsession really is.
I think that's true, and it's so true, especially from the sort of humanitarian, human rights, environmental justice, racial justice, and so forth, that piece is so integral to the Green New Deal or the Green Deal, whatever you call it in your respective country, that trying to get that message across, that you really can't endorse an industry like nuclear power within a Green New Deal if you're advocating for third world and global majority and underprivileged communities and so forth. It's just a complete contradiction. And we've had that same challenge in the US, trying to get the Sunrise Movement on board, and they, you know, aren't even talking to us. So, but I think it varies from country to country. We've seen Fridays for the Future, for example, in Germany, very strong, obviously, on the nuclear point. Other countries maybe not really taking it on. So maybe that'll come up in the Q&A. So I'm going to, at this point, I think, because we've got about 45 minutes left in the program, go off the air myself and turn it over to Jacqui and to Russell too, I believe, who are going to pull some of the questions from the Q&A. So again, a reminder that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. The chat is your own forum, but the Q&A is where we're going to look for the questions. So I'll let you take it from here, Jacqui. And thank you so much for the great contributions you've all made so far. I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. One of the questions raised is the issue of the scam that's part of our title. And I think one of the scams around nuclear power is the idea of low carbon. And I'm just wondering whether somebody would want to develop on that and you know, focus in a little bit more on how and why the general public are being scammed where nuclear power is, and perhaps in words that public campaigners, non-expert campaigners could possibly use in their own communities. Yes, Ian, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I think if you look at a nuclear power station, I mean, the last one I went anywhere near was Torness. I mean, it's a big concrete box. It sits there. There's no visible emissions coming from it. You know, it's quiet. It's, you know, occasional lorry load goes in and lots of electricity comes out, and it's quite easy to believe that there are no emissions as such. But reality is obviously not the case. I mean, there's a huge CO2 footprint with nuclear energy. Quite apart from mining it, refining it, we don't have any indigenous uranium, so it has to be dragged from places like Canada, Africa for the most part, and Australia. So there's a huge footprint just getting the stuff here. A lot of the better uranium ores were used up a long time ago, which is why it was predicted that we'd run out of readily accessible uranium in the 1950s when everyone was switching over to it, which is why they came up with fast breeder reactors to carry on generating plutonium fuel from the finite uranium resource. That never happened, but uranium ores are declining. So the energy required to extract uranium is increasing all the time. You get to a point where it takes more energy to extract the uranium than you will actually get from fissioning it, but we're not there yet with that. But then there's the huge problem of waste storage. I believe in 2016, Sellafield had a gas bill of something like £20 million, which most of that was to run the waste ponds, the cooling, the pumps, etc., even though Sellafield no longer generates any electricity. So clearly that there is a massive CO2 footprint associated with nuclear power, and that's before you even start to talk about building them and the huge amounts of concrete required. Yes, we can get into figures about the huge concrete foundation for wind turbines and the like. But I think nuclear power has a much bigger footprint than is realised by the vast majority of people. I think it's easy to believe it's zero or low carbon, but if the reality is far from that.
Jacqui, the difficulty is that it very quickly becomes a dispute between academics. And from the work of Benjamin Sovacool, who perhaps is the greatest exponent of a very high carbon footprint for nuclear over its lifetime operating, that includes the lifetime of the waste. You've then got academics on the other side of the debate who say that it's very low carbon, lower carbon, some of them claim, than renewables. Nobody yet claims it's lower carbon than energy efficiency investments, by the way, which is encouraging. So the difficulty is that the nuclear industry has been able to play this academic dispute to their benefit. Does that amount to a scam? Well, yes, but it's only fair to say that a lot of the studies haven't come out as firmly as Ian obviously would think that they would, and I clearly would like them to. There has been a bit of a mixed picture on that front.
Jacqui, could I jump in? Can I jump in on the scam?
Please do.
Just to list some things which I think fall into the scam category. It's expensive. It doesn't cut bills. It constantly relies on the prospect of new technology, which hasn't yet been developed in the way that they say it is. So at the moment, the talk is of the small modular reactors and the advanced modular reactors, and millions yet again have been put into nuclear fusion with the goal of a working nuclear fusion plant by 2040, and constantly this technology has failed to deliver and will probably fail to deliver again. It will not and does not come online in a way which will allow us to meet our climate targets, and that's one of the biggest scams. And the final scam that I will add onto that list is that it doesn't come online to tackle our climate targets. And I'm really sorry I've forgotten it. So if I remember it, I will jump back in again. But it's a list of scams from a government that is very, very good at scamming us on a whole number of issues, and it's scamming us on this one as well.
Thank you, thank you. We've got a question here from Sean Morris from Nuclear Free Local Authorities, who's joined us tonight. Thank you, welcome, Sean. So what would perhaps this is one for Katrine, and then everybody else could jump in if they wanted to. What would your advice be to help trade unionists influence those unions who support nuclear power and, I suppose, and nuclear weapons? And in the same way, for Labour Party activists within their party, when so few of their MPs really want to discuss the issue. We're all coming across this when we're doing grassroots campaigning around this issue. So, Katrine, have you any advice, any way of digging through this difficulty and these barriers that we all come across?
I think obviously, it's a mass movement. 6 million trade unionists. Not everybody is going to be believe in the nuclear message, or not everybody is going to work in the nuclear industry or associated areas. But I think probably some of them that do work in those areas, if you do actually pose an alternative to them, will be receptive to that. But I think people are worried about, keeping a roof over their heads and everything else. So it has to be linked with a positive message about, what jobs we want in our communities, how do we keep people's standard of living up as well, and that there is a real drive to do that. And I think that has to come from the trade union movement as well, because we can't rely on politicians to sort this out for us. We've seen that over the whole number of years now. We have to do it ourselves. But I think that's why getting communities to really feel, what do we need? what positive messages do, we need a bus service that actually comes into this community after 6 o'clock at night. We need, to keep work to be done on our homes. We want jobs to be coming into this area, not taken out of this area, and so on. So there's a whole range of stuff that I think we can appeal to people, but it's also talking with them and discussing with people, because I think we can't just say, oh, you're a lost cause, and everything else. I think we need to engage with people, find out what their issues are, and actually come up with an alternative that addresses those issues, but work with them on developing the alternative in the communities themselves as well. And if you involve people, and I think, just a week of train strikes has raised people's sights. Actually, we could do something here. There is an appetite for doing something more, and people's sights are being raised and widened, I think, in terms of what is possible now. And I think it's a really important moment in time that we can really capitalize on and move things forward. But yeah, it's difficult, and there will be some people we never convince, but there's a lot of people out there. If you address the practicalities of how you're going to make ends meet, how you're going to keep a roof over your head, how you feed your family, then I think we can make real inroads and get people on board.
Thank you.
Okay.
Would anybody else like to come in on that?
Okay.
Linda.
I was just going to ask for a bit of a special privilege, because I have Linda Rogers from People Against Willoughby sitting next to me. She cannot put her question in the Q&A because I'm a panelist. So I'm going to just move the camera around and let her ask the question live, if that's okay, because otherwise she can't get in there at all. So here you go, Linda, it's all yours.
I'm very grateful to you all. I think one of the scams that's making me most cross at the moment is around the regulated asset base, which you have been talking about, and the big scam that says it's going to save the public £30 billion, whilst at the same time the excellent group against Sizewell C are pointing out that the figures for the RAB have actually been redacted, and the government has the front to say it's in the public interest to do this. You can hardly believe it. So how do we hold a government to account which will scam so blatantly, basically, is my question to you. Thank you very much.
I could just pitch in there and say there's a long way to go with this RAB, with the RAB process. It's not by any means a done deal yet. It will clearly underpin if there is going to be a declaration of support from the government, an FID, then clearly they will base it on the fact that the funding mechanism is going to come through a regulated asset-based device. But there's a lot of debate still to be had. The degree to which they're keeping critical financial information out of the public domain, as you just mentioned, is astonishing. And there were so many raised eyebrows in the House of Lords about whether or not it was legitimate actually to have a vote when a lot of the critical information regarding the thing you were being asked to vote on was not actually available to you. So I wouldn't necessarily think that's a done deal. The evidence from America, of course, is absolutely compelling in this regard, because in America they've tried an RAB equivalent. It was called early something recovery, early financing recovery, or something like that. And it has cost US consumers in America astonishing amounts of money. And of course, there's only one extant example of this mechanism still operating for the Vogtle reactors now. And when you look at the actual imposition on consumers' bills, it's completely staggering. So I have a request here. That US example is really important and needs to be shared much more widely here in the UK.
Well, we actually had a comment, and I'm assuming it was from somebody in the US. I think it was somebody in the US when they were talking about battery storage systems and how that seems to have. Perhaps Linda could say more about that. I'm not sure whether you do, but she said battery storage systems, are they being used in the United Kingdom, because they're actually in the US, I'm assuming, seem to be going well, and people have been getting money back on their utilities from the utility companies. Why is that? Why is that not being pushed more in this country? Does anybody know the answer to that?
It distracts from their current model of large power stations producing, centralized power stations producing large amounts of power. It prevents the democratization of, if you like, electricity generation with community wind turbines, solar panels, solar farms, whatever. They don't like it. One of the advantages is it's centralized, it's controllable, and that makes them feel a little bit itchy, I think. So,
and because they don't have a particular interest in renewable energy, because it's renewable energy that absolutely requires the battery storage, and they have no serious interest in moving us to 100% or close to 100% renewable energy, and we can see that really clearly both in terms of the support that they have for nuclear, but also what they have just recently done using the horribly using the war in Ukraine as a justification for their continued support for fossil fuels, really, which was an agenda that they were so happy to return to, and the outrageous announcements made by Sunak recently, where he simultaneously announces a windfall tax, and then with the other hand gives back in massive tax breaks to the oil and gas companies, where essentially we will be paying for new oil, either existing plans or new oil and gas investments at this moment in time. So they really have no serious interest in the huge investment that needs to take place in battery storage, because that requires a vision to think in terms of renewable energy as our main energy source. And I have remembered the other scam. The other scam is that nuclear deals with intermittency. We need nuclear because of to deal with the intermittency of renewable energy, but it does absolutely nothing to address intermittency. Battery storage does something. Energy efficiency tackles intermittency. New nuclear just provides nuclear constantly in operation and cannot power up and power down to address the intermittency of renewable energy.
Jacqui, just a word to reassure people, don't panic on the storage front. There is a lot of money going into increasingly large storage schemes here in the UK. It's almost all private sector money. It doesn't require subsidy. The National Grid is extremely keen to encourage these investments, and almost all new solar schemes now come with solar plus storage built in. So it's slightly under the radar at the moment. That's probably not a bad thing, because what we're seeing is less meddling from government in that particular part of our distribution system than in other places.
I think another bit of the scam is the corruption as well. Let's call it what it is. There was a report about 10 years ago by Caroline Lucas called "The Corruption of Governance," which is about the placement, if you like, of nuclear industry interns. I use that term advisedly, within the Department of the Environment or whatever it was calling itself that day, who are basically involved with formulating government policy. And I can't imagine this doesn't still happen. I mean, the oil industry does the same, all major industries do the same. And actually asked the direct question of the minister, why are you employing interns from the nuclear industry? So we can't afford to employ, conventional civil servants, which is absolutely ridiculous. They know what's happening, and they're allowing industry representatives into the heart of government. So there's clearly an element of that still going on. It's following a very similar playbook to the tobacco industry, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think influencing government policy, casting doubt upon the science, and whatever, and just sowing the seeds of doubt without actually ever overtly revealing themselves.
Yeah, and I've got, and Jonathan mentioned, and I think maybe you did, Ian, as well, subsidies, and they're one of the biggest scams, aren't they? Where nuclear power concerned. You've probably noticed, I don't know whether you've had chance, whether everybody's had chance to look at the chat box, and we've had a couple of pro-nuclear pro-nuclear junkies in there who have been dominating the chat box. Sorry, I've got a hair in my eye. And Linda Walker from Chernobyl Children's Project UK has a comment and a question to make, and I think that's valid, seeing as we've been putting up with the two baton carriers for the nuclear power industry. And Linda says, we have a nuclear junkie in the chat who is trying to convince us that nuclear reactors don't produce waste, and practically no one ever died as a result of nuclear accidents. Could Jonathon and Ian, and maybe Katrine and Suzanne as well, tell us more about how serious the Chernobyl disaster was and how close other accidents have come to total catastrophe? And again, you see, these sort of disasters, as we know, are another scam, aren't they? Because they are hushed up and quieted down, and people are made to feel that they're being hysterical by talking about these issues. So I think that would be very valid. If Jonathon, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes. Again, this is an area of great dispute between many experts, international organizations. To start with, the UN has carried out detailed studies of the health impacts of both Chernobyl and Fukushima, and independent studies have checked those figures. And it's fair to say that thousands of people over time from Chernobyl have died. It's not possible to talk about the death count, to put it bluntly, from Fukushima, because that will play out over a much longer period of time. But I suspect that the thrust of this question is that relative to other sources of energy up until now, particularly fossil fuels, particularly coal, the nuclear industry has killed relatively few people as a consequence of the huge amount of low carbon electricity that it has put into our grids since the 1960s. And frankly, that is true. That is true. Relative to coal, the nuclear industry is relatively benign. And there is no point beating around that bush. Coal continues to kill many, many more people than nuclear today. So we just have to be a little bit careful about that. I personally don't put as much emphasis on the dangers of nuclear reactors as many other campaigners do, because the operating reality for large numbers of nuclear reactors in well-managed and well-regulated countries is a reasonably good record. The other story about nuclear reactors don't generate waste, well, that's just bonkers and off-the-wall rubbish. And you do seriously need to get your act together before making statements of that kind, because that's not in any doubt. Just go to the government's own inventory of nuclear wastes arising from different reactors year by year over the last 50 years here in the UK, and you can see exactly what it amounts to, ton by ton, amount of radioactivity per unit of waste generated, the decommissioning costs that I mentioned before. I mean, don't get into idiocy saying there's no nuclear waste coming from the nuclear industry, because that's just mad.
Would anybody else like to come in on that?
I agree with Jonathon to a degree. I mean, one of the most dangerous forms of electricity generation apparently is hydroelectric power. In the past century, apparently that's killed now on 1 million people from dam bursts and the like. So yes, the dangers of nuclear power, I'm not going to say overstated, are somewhat more hidden, I would say. I'll be a bit more nuanced about it. I think it increases, you can't measure the increasing risk of cancer in the population easily. It's like trying to, did someone unequivocally die of traffic pollution? It was a contributory factor. I think that needs to come out as well. I think there is an element of increased risk of cancer. Now, would that person have got cancer if there had been no nuclear, there hadn't been downwind of a nuclear power station? Who knows? So it's an increased risk, and this is what the tobacco industry paid on. I believe to this day, there's no one's proved an unequivocal link between smoking and lung cancer, but there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence enough to ban smoking, etc. But and I think nuclear power industry is possibly in the same category as that. I'm not saying the nuclear. I have, as Jonathon, I've stayed away from arguing about the dangers, the actual dangers from cancer of nuclear power stations, because you disappear down an epidemiological rabbit hole and you never come out again. You know, you start at Hiroshima and it just expands from there. And there are much bigger sticks to beat the nuclear industry with in terms of getting rid of it as quickly as possible. I think in the future it will come out that nuclear power is a lot more dangerous than many people make out, but the proof of that will be very difficult to come by, I think. I'm not saying it's safe, I'm saying it is dangerous, and I think it is possibly a lot more dangerous than a lot of people realise, I think.
I think we should probably steer the conversation back towards the focus that we began with, but I think that something, and I'm sorry to jump in here, but just from our perspective, I mean, I think what you raised, Jonathon, about Ukraine ought to wake people up to the true health impacts. And this is something we look at a lot at Beyond Nuclear, the true potential health impacts. We know enough about Chernobyl to know that if any one of those reactors in Ukraine was hit and breached, it is infinitely worse than the Chernobyl 1986 disaster. Unimaginable, I think was the word you used, Jonathon. That's absolutely true. So the amount of people who would suffer immediately and over the long term, the level of thyroid cancers, prolonged diseases, genetic defects, and on, is monumental. And it would be a vast area, probably much larger than the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And depending on which way the wind blows, affect far more countries than even Chernobyl did. And I think that is the crux of the problem that we addressed earlier, which is there's a failure to understand that nuclear power is not the benign stepchild of nuclear weapons. In many ways, if those reactors were breached in Ukraine, it would be worse than the use of a single tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, because of the longevity of the isotopes that would be released and the amount of time that they would continue to harm people down generations. So even though the epidemiology hasn't been done, which is part of the problem, and it's very difficult to ascertain, cause and effect, we know enough to know that this is a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions waiting to happen, and it's not an acceptable bargain. And it's not an acceptable bargain to dump our waste into the Irish Sea, which is what's being tried now, and dump it on marine animals. There's a level of irresponsibility that we have with nuclear power that we don't take responsibility for, in addition to all the costs. And so, but I do want to, turn it back to some of the questions in the Q&A that pertain specifically to the jobs, climate, union issues that we started talking about at the beginning. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to throw that in there. Back to you, Jacqui.
Thank you. I'm just going through. We've got a lot of questions. A lot of questions talking about the environment, and actually I would say to our audience to have a look at our past webinars where we have actually covered those issues. So I was just going to have a look to see, does anybody have any ideas how many green jobs have been created over the last 20 years? Especially when environmental groups and International Trade Union Major Group were pushing for this at the UN Commission on Sustainable Development. Do we feel that there's been any real progress in this area?
You mean in the UK?
Yes, in the UK.
Well, the government has this thing called the Green Jobs Task Force. God knows what it does, but it does actually. One of the things it claims to do is to assess the number of jobs in different parts of the economy, and there's a formal definition of what green jobs are, which some people go along with and some people don't. The really interesting thing is that if you look back from, 2013, 2014, around there, to where we were in 2021, the increase in green jobs has been very small indeed. It's pretty much plateaued. If I remember the last report from the Green Jobs Task Force, which tells us that there hasn't been any clear strategic encouragement in those markets of the kind that would make a huge difference. And we all know what that is. You only have to take heat pumps. The assessment from the industry itself that they will need something like 20,000 newly trained, highly qualified installers to get anywhere close to fitting the number of heat pumps, installing the number of heat pumps that are going to be needed over the next 5 years, let alone to get to the 600,000 heat pumps per annum by 2028, which is the government's target. So the government comes out with all of these targets and then does nothing to build the supply chain. And that's what is utterly sickening, frankly. It's so easy to come up with these idiotic targets and then do nothing about them. And this heat pump potential is so exciting. It would make such a difference in the lives of so many people.
From our point of view, in the trade union movement, I think a lot of what the government says is greenwashing, and they're just pretending they're doing something on these issues, given the strength of feeling in communities. And I think that's part of the issue. Is what we're trying to get over to people is a vision of how it could be, and what is necessary in our communities to address all the pollution, all the issues just in the local areas, let alone anything else. And one of the government strategies at the moment is closing local offices and putting everybody in these big super centres where everybody has to travel much further to get there. And they're saying, oh, we're closing down inefficient buildings rather than retrofitting buildings and making them more efficient. It's taking jobs out of communities and putting them in fewer locations and big super factories that aren't the most efficient way of delivering services to the public as well. So most of what the government is doing, you can take with a pinch of salt, which is why we need to develop the alternative and what's needed and capture that imagination. And I think we can do that now. But all of these things, you need to have a drive, and you can't leave things in the hands of the market. You have to actually have a drive to do these things, democratically in the public domain, and putting solar panels on every roof of every public building in the country, looking at heat pumps and everything else, that in a very systematic way is what's needed. But they're not interested in doing that. It's all this piecemeal look at what we're doing, but actually no real drive to make it work.
And just picking up on what both Jonathan and Katrine have said in terms of supply chains, the big gap is in education and training. There is an absolute a desert in terms of education and training. I'm a school teacher in my day job. My partner works in FE and further education, and if I think about the curriculum that we have in our schools at this moment in time, it does not match the climate emergency. It does not match the knowledge and skills that young people want to have as they go into their future. If we go into our further education colleges, which are absolutely crucial in terms of allowing young people to continue their education and develop the vocational skills that they need to go into the workplaces, you have a horrible catch-22 situation where courses are only put on, apprenticeship courses, for example, are only put on if they can be matched with jobs in the community. And because those jobs are not there in the community, the courses are not put on. The courses, in fact, are closed down often. I had friends who worked in a South London college. Years ago, it ran a brilliant course in terms of solar panel fitting, and it was closed down because there wasn't enough market opportunities out there. And you have this, it goes on and on and on, which is why I think one other element, and Katrina mentioned it, young people, they're not being given the chance in their education to prepare for the jobs that they would want to see us create in our societies. But also, therefore, one thing that Katrine mentioned, I think, is quite important, that there is a need, therefore, for public ownership of certain, I mean, I would advocate it quite widely, but even if we just limit it, public ownership, where we run a mass retrofitting program across the UK, publicly run, for public good, using our taxpayers' money for that rather than some of the things that we've spoken about tonight, would also allow us to build and develop the courses, the training and the skills that are needed. And then, of course, if we were able to do something similar in terms of what Jonathan was saying about heat pumps, you know, then we suddenly start to see a transformation of our economy, and we really then start to see the development of green jobs across the economy. And for me, Jonathon mentioned the different debates. It can be a loose definition of a green job, but it has to have something to do with actually addressing our climate crisis. These have to be jobs that allow us to reduce our emissions. Otherwise, really, it is just a horrible piece of greenwashing, and they're not even capable of good greenwashing on that front at this moment in time. But skills and education is a massive hole which which drags down over and over again the possibility of creating these kind of jobs.
There's a blueprint for it as well. Kirklees Council, is it in the Northwest? No, Warmfront scheme in the 90s insulated, well, set out to insulate every house in the town, I believe. Now that would have created jobs. So there's a blueprint of how they did it. They got government funding, I believe, to do it. But it has been done in the past. We're not in unknown territory here. It's just presumably what they did needs scaling up massively. And it's not rocket science, is it? Installing insulation. It's not, you know, we think we can store nuclear waste for 100,000 years without it leaking or without future generations taking it out and throwing it at each other. We can do that fine, but we can't insulate every house in the country. There's something strange going on there, isn't there? A failure of imagination, or more likely the application of ideology, I think.
So I mean, this does. I mean, as I was listening to you, I was sort of going down a new Lucas plan sort of thing in my head, and wondering whether something like that along in that sort of vein would be useful, that way of thinking, because there've been questions about how do the general public, people that want to campaign on this issue, that are not experts, how do they sort of move this forward? How would one move this forward? And if you don't know what the options are, and that information is not all together in one place, and that was sort of why I was starting to think about the work that the new Lucas plan, and Sam Mason from PCS was instrumental in that. How do we sort of pull this together so that campaigners, or members of the general public that don't have that information, can sort of get that information in a sort of a one-stop shop sort of situation? Do we think that that's even possible to do?
I think there's been a lot of pressure on councils to sign up to make a commitment to zero CO2 emissions. Been a lot of movements for that, carbon-free, name your town, etc. So I think the councils have been very willing to, at the very least, give the appearance of cutting carbon emissions. If we actually present them with a practical thing they can do, rather than just signing a declaration, I think maybe that we can apply that. We can apply the momentum from carbon-free towns to actually getting them to do something. Or why don't you insulate over your council housing stock or whatever, and apply pressure that way? And this, I think, is where youth movements, if you like XR, come in. They make a lot of noise. They scare councils because they show up their failings. And I think it's a way of engaging people. And who's going to disagree with lower energy bills and potentially subsidised insulation? It's a, you will make yourself popular, and you might get elected next time because of it. So it's a start there. I think let's start at the ground. There's no point talking to ministers, I think, and try and get it from the top down. I mean, part of the reason of this, because I've been patted on the head so often by civil servants and government ministers. Oh yes, all smiles, and then business as usual. Have to start from the bottom up and start with the groundwork that's been laid by the climate movement and the zero carbon declaration of getting them to sign declarations to cut their CO2 emissions. Start with that and work up from there, I think.
I think the importance, the example of the Lucas plan and all the work that's been done on the anniversary and sort of popularising the idea, is that the ideas came from the workforce themselves. So it's that marvellous idea that there's people with all the skills and expertise to create arms, but actually that can produce something much better for society if you garner that. If you point the skills and expertise in a different direction. So, but the ideas are, you know, in the working class as a whole. So I think, you know, that's the positive thing, is actually involve people in the workplaces where, you know, what is being produced in the energy sector and so on, but across all the workplaces in our communities, is there a better way of doing this? What skills have you got? How can that be used better for society as a whole? And what do you need to do it? And I think we'll come up with, you know, a whole range of things out of the trade union movement. But that is the key thing, is you have to give people the opportunity to develop those ideas themselves, and you know, we'll come up with some brilliant ways forward from our movement.
I think, Jacqui, one of the problems may be not too little information, but too much information. I mean, there is so much stuff out there about how to now build these grassroots, community supported, but local government endorsed campaigns to build that new kind of infrastructure and that new economy. If you just, for instance, look at what New Economics Foundation is doing about its new, the Great Housing Retrofit, it's a fantastic campaign. Look at the Ashton Awards that have got an absolutely amazing, very practical guide for local authorities, all of whom, well, all of the ones that have signed up to a climate emergency and then done absolutely sod all in order to actually do anything about it. And then I think in the chat, somebody mentioned Bristol Energy Centre, so there are lots of local initiatives. Honestly, I think that the problem will be for people is that it's very easy to get overwhelmed by all of that, and finding the route into the thing that's going to be most useful to you is actually the really difficult bit.
Thank you, thank you. I think we're coming up to 9 o'clock. I'm really sorry we had so many questions, and we just haven't been able to get to everything. I think we will have a copy of the chat box. If anybody wants that, they can get in touch with us at Greater Manchester and District CND. Linda, do you want to finish us off, top and tail it, if you like, if you want to? Well, like that. Thank you, everybody.
First of all, thank you to our great team of guests. It was a very stimulating, interesting conversation. I really appreciate you all taking your time this evening to be here. We should also get a copy of the Q&A. So sometimes what we do offer is that if there are some questions in the Q&A that can be answered by any one of us, we will endeavor to share it with our panelists and ourselves. And your email address will be where you registered unless you entered the Q&A anonymously. So we can offline reply to some of the questions we couldn't get to tonight. But otherwise, I just want to thank all the audience. Was tremendous. The panel was fantastic, and I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you.